Hello everyone, we hope you have a good day. Today we will be discussing Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. For our report, we will not be able to tackle all of the books. Instead, we'll focus on books 1, 2, and 10. Book 1, The Human Good, Book 2, Moral Virtue, and Book 10, Pleasure, Happiness. When we study philosophy, isa sa mga matunog na pangalan ay si Aristotle. Aristotle is a Greek philosopher who studied under Plato and later went on to build his own school, the Lyceum. Hindi lamang siya sa philosophy kilala. He has also made great contributions in different fields like biology, chemistry, and physics. However, he is well known as a philosopher and is often brought up in the study of ethics and politics. Aristotle's study of ethics led him to write 10 books and compiled them into what is known as the Nicomachean Ethics. Although nagsulat siya ng dalawang treatise about ethics, ito yung Nicomachean and Eudaimonian. Halos same lang din yung sinasabi nila about ethics. Magkaiba lang sila with the organization and sinasabi ng scholars na parang improved version ng Eudaimonian ethics ang Nicomachean ethics that we will discuss. A little fact about this is that it was named after his father or his son, both of which were named Nicomachus. The book discusses happiness and how it can be achieved as the end goal of man. This will be further discussed as we go on with this lecture. Let us discuss Book 1, The Human Good. Here, Aristotle said that the study of the human good has something to do with politics. Tingin niyo bakit? Well, dahil ang politics daw ay concerned sa pag-secure ng highest ends ng bawat tao. We also note that Aristotle is well known for his study on politics at nakikita niya ang political science as something that can be achieved and preserve happiness sa society, and thus sa individuals. Going back, what are these highest ends na nasabi kanina? Aristotle established that the highest form of good that humans aim to achieve is happiness. Sino nga ba naman sa atin ang ayaw maging masaya, di ba? Para sa kanya, kapag masaya ang tao, it means that they are living well. Kaya ito ang highest form of good. He then went on to say that happiness can be felt through different means. Kasi as people, we have different goals and we aim for happiness through different ways. Para sa iba, ito yung dream job nila. Sa iba, ito yung matapos nila yung mga kailangan nilang tapusin. For us college students, ito yung katulad na nasa picture is makasablay at makagraduate. May mga nagsasabi na ang happiness can be achieved through different means tulad na lamang ng pleasure. Dito, sinasabi ni Aristotle na mababaw lamang ang pag-achieve ng happiness by pleasure and mas sufficient lamang ito for animals and not people. Others naman say that happiness is achieved by receiving honor. But again, hindi nasusukat ng honor ang tingin ng tao sa sarili niya, but what others think of him. All of these are just inferior sa kung ano talaga ang meaning ng happiness. Happiness, according to Aristotle, is the end goal that we want to achieve. For example, students that want to graduate, and for writers, yung aim nila to achieve is to finish writing their next piece. Athletes, yung aim nila is to win gold medals. These goals are different for everyone. We have to remember that achieving this is not just nature or yung pre-existing. Kailangan din ng determination. Hence, happiness is a combination of both. Example, if you want to achieve a goal you set up, hindi lang basta dapat magaling ka sa bagay yan. Kailangan din that you have the determination to work and practice for it. Gaya ng nasabi kanina, for Aristotle, happiness is not pleasure, honor, or even praise. Happiness is something that is achieved with perfect virtue. Pero ano nga ba itong mga virtues na ito? And how can we uphold them? This is what Book 2, Moral Virtue, talks and delves further about.
In Book 2 of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle mentioned two kinds of virtue. The first one is called intellectual virtue. It is formed by instruction and processing textbook knowledge, gaya na lamang ng pagkatuto natin sa loob ng isang classroom. On the other hand, merong tinatawag na moral virtue. Moral virtue is formed by constant practice and habits. For example, the moral virtue generosity can be obtained through frequent acts of giving and sharing, no matter how big or small the generous act is. Other examples of moral virtue that can be formed by habits are honesty, courage, compassion, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self-control, and prudence. Habits do not form overnight. Thus, moral virtue does not come naturally for all of us. They are just formed the moment we adapt and learn activities properly. A musician learns an instrument by practice. In the same way, we learn virtue through practice, not by mere words or thoughts, but by action. But as some habits can be produced, certain habits can also become unpracticed in the long run. When that happens, virtue can be lost. Sabi nga nila, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. Pero di bale, pinanganak naman tayong lahat ng may potential to be morally good. And pwede nating turuan ang ating mga sarili kung paano maging virtuous at kumilos sa nararapat na paraan. Pero ang tanong ngayon, ano nga ba ang nararapat na paraan? How do we know what is the right conduct in any circumstance given that they can vary and become unexpected? To answer this question, Aristotle laid down the doctrine of the golden mean. According to this principle, to observe right conduct in any situation means to find the middle ground between deficiency and excess. Find balance. Too much or too little can destroy a man, and that's why he can only be conserved by the means. So, the right choice, it is in the middle. For example, courage entails striking a balance between timidity and rashness. However, the proper level of courage fluctuates depending still on the scenario. Furthermore, in cultivating moral value, it is also crucial that we approach pleasure and pain with the right attitude. Be careful not to fall into the temptation of doing bad things in pursuit of pleasure. At the same time, when you're in pain, don't allow suffering to disable you from doing the right thing. Usually, pleasure is harder to fight with. Meron din tayong criteria para malaman kung totoong virtuous nga ba ang isang tao and not just by accident. Una, virtuous people just know when they are behaving the right way. Pangalawa, they choose it for the sake of being virtuous. Pangatlo, for their behavior also manifests itself as part of a fixed, various disposition.
To be virtuous, we must first remember that virtue is a part of the soul, which consists of passion, capacity, and state of character. Out of all of these, virtue is a state of character, dahil ito ang kondisyon kung anong klaseng kilos, good or bad, ang gagawin based on feelings. If we will stay within the mean or go to the extremes, itong virtue or state of character ang magde-decide kung paano tayo mag-acto. Nasabi kanina na may tendency tayo to act with deficiency, excess, or intermediate, but to achieve virtue is to remain within the mean. Although, isa sa mga sinabi ni Aristotle na may mga times na hindi natin may iwasan na mag-stray toward the extremes. At if may time na mangyari ito, it should be at the right time, the right moment, to the right person, at kung ano pa. Bale, if you go to the extremes, hindi lamang dahil biglaan or because of rash decisions. Dapat pinag-iisipan kung tama ba ang gagawin to stay within the mean. Although we must still be wary because being virtuous does not just come from actions, pero dapat they should be done in a certain way along the mean. Kaya naman, nagbigay ng 3 rules of conduct si Aristotle. One is to avoid extremes na malayo sa mean or the extremes na ikapapahamak mo and will stray you away from your end goal. 2. Be aware of errors that we did para maiwasan sila sa susunod. And lastly, be wary of pleasure. Katulad ng nasabi kanina, pleasure is harder to fight against. Kaya mas maganda na maging maingat with things that we find pleasurable because it might cloud our judgment. Throughout all of this, we have mentioned virtue and happiness. But how are they connected? While happiness is a way of life, this can be manifested on how we act. While virtue is a state of being rather than action. Nasabi kanina na without virtue, we cannot truly achieve happiness. Dahil happiness can be achieved through acting with virtuous disposition. Hindi lang yung basta-bastang gumagalaw sa buhay, but minding the actions that you do and having this disposition. Sabi nga kanina, moral virtue is about habit. To have the habit of being virtuous can make one happy. This slide just says that to be virtuous is to find out the past mistakes that we have made and learn from them. To do good because of them. Kasi hindi naman tayo mga perfectong tao. There are times when we can be at our extremes. Sabi ni Aristotle sa last part ng book 2, that straying away from the mean for a short time is something that should not be blamed sa person. But yung person na nag-stray na yun should notice that they have that they have strayed from good and therefore go back and learn. So, as long as we learn from what we did and stay in the path of the mean, we stay virtuous. To remember to be wary of pleasure.
Dadako naman tayo sa Book 10 kung saan pinag-uusapan ng pleasure. Some people think pleasure is good, while others are persuaded to think that pleasure is not. It is thoroughly bad. The latter thinks so and avoids pleasure because they do not want to become slaves to their own desires. These two opposing views of whether pleasure is good or bad presented some arguments. In the discussion that pleasure is good, a member of Plato's Academy named Eudoxus argued that pleasure is the supreme good because all creatures aim for it. And usually, whatever we seek or aim is what's good for us and gives us nourishment. Pain, on the other hand, is something we avoid, thus, it must be bad. Pleasure is also said to be good because adding pleasure makes other good things more desirable and worthy of choice. Meanwhile, in the discussion that pleasure is bad, Plato argued that intelligence makes pleasure even better. How could pleasure be the supreme good kung ganon? It just means that there are other things that can be good aside from pleasure. And again, pleasure is not the supreme good. Pleasure is said to be bad because not everything we seek is good. For example, we have sinful pleasures like vices, or pleasures considered to be wrong by most standards. Furthermore, pleasure is argued to be bad because evil can be opposed to evil or to something neutral. Even if pain is bad, it does not follow that pleasure is good. Both pleasure and pain could be bad, and both are opposed to a neutral state, which is good. Next, pleasure also admits degrees or qualifications. Kung good ang pleasure, dapat maging simply good in itself, self-sufficient, or without needing anything. Another argument that explains pleasure is bad is how pleasure is not a quality. But Aristotle refuted this argument. He gave an example that virtue and happiness are both goods kahit naman hindi sila qualities. Last but not the least, the argument for pleasure being bad is based on the mistaken notion that pleasure is an incomplete process of replenishment. But Aristotle says that it is not. It is not a process. Aristotle makes his own reasoning regarding pleasure. Pleasure is not actually the highest good, but only one of the goods. Nabanggit nga kanina na the highest good should be self-sufficient or without needing anything. Aristotle defined pleasure instead as something that accompanies the activity of any of our faculties, like the senses or the mind, when they are working at their best. Pleasure perfects our activities, and since life in itself is an activity, pleasure is essential to life. Only those pleasures enjoyed by a good person and for the right reasons are good. An example is how we find a friend better than a flatterer, because a friend watches out for our best interests and not just does or says what we want to hear or see. With this example, we can say that there are some things we place higher value on other than pleasure. As for happiness, Nicomachean Ethics states that contemplation is the highest form of happiness. Contemplation is an activity of our highest rational faculties and is an end in itself. Only a god could spend an entire lifetime occupied with nothing but contemplation. But we should try to practice this godlike behavior as we can. So why did Aristotle see contemplative life as the highest form of happiness? Well, because Aristotle has a teleological view of nature na nagsasabi na ang telos, or goal of human life, is the exercise of our rational powers. Thus, we should live a contemplative life.
Overall, the Nicomachean Ethics says that we live well when we feel happiness. The activities that we have done and are currently doing will eventually lead to a life that we have built to attain goodness. It is now up to us to make a habit of these good practices and achieve the highest human good, happiness. Now we ask, what is your goal? How can you achieve happiness? We you can mull this over, magmuni-muni kayo kung ano nga ba yung goal nyo and kung ang mga actions nyo ba will make you achieve this goal and thus happiness. Thank you and have a nice day.